I was 69 years old the day I closed the door of my house for the last time and handed the keys to the realtor. There was no dramatic scene, no tears in that exact moment, just a strange kind of quiet. It was the quiet that comes after you finally make a decision you had been avoiding for years. I didn't know it yet, but I was closing much more than the door of a house. My name is Carol Mitchell. I am 69 years old. I spent almost 30 years working as a medical assistant in a small clinic outside Grand Rapids, Michigan, the kind of job where you know half the patients by name and the other half by their coffee order. For most of my adult life, my days followed a script I never questioned. Work, family, routine, and a marriage of 41 years that I believed, without ever really thinking about it, would simply go on forever. Then my husband Richard died, and I discovered how large a house can feel when there is only one person left inside it. In the first months after the funeral, there were phone calls, visits, neighbors knocking on the door with casseroles nobody would ever finish. My 2 children came by almost every week. But life has a way of continuing whether you're ready or not. People go back to work. Grandchildren have soccer practice. Birthdays come and go, and eventually everyone settles back into their own routines. I don't blame them for that. That's simply how life works. The problem was that I no longer knew what my own routine was supposed to be. My son David works 2 jobs and is raising 3 kids of his own outside Lansing. My daughter Sarah lives 2 hours away and puts in more than 60 hours a week at a hospital administration job that swallows her whole. They love me. I have never once doubted that. But love doesn't fill an empty house. It doesn't do anything about the hour of 7 in the evening, when dinner is finished, the dishes are dried, and the television isn't enough to keep the silence from creeping back in. I spent 4 years like that in Michigan, staring out the same kitchen window at the same street, the same neighbors, walking the same dogs, the same long winters that seem to start earlier every year and end later. I told myself this was simply what widowhood looked like. I told myself I should be grateful I had my health, my children nearby, a paid-off house, a small pension. And for a while, I believed that gratitude was supposed to be enough. It wasn't until one particular evening that something in me finally cracked open. I had planned dinner with Sarah for the 3rd time that month, and for the 3rd time in a row, she had to cancel because something came up at work. I understood. I always understood. But that night, after I hung up the phone, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a plate I had cooked for 2 people, and I asked myself, out loud, to no one, what exactly I was doing with whatever time I had left. I don't have a beautiful answer for what happened after that. I only know that I opened my laptop and started searching for places where American retirees were living on less money and somehow more life. I read forum after forum late into the night, the way some people binge a television series. Costa Rica, Portugal, Mexico, Ecuador, and then, again and again, a name I had never once heard in 69 years on this earth. Dumaguete. I couldn't even pronounce it correctly the first few times I said it aloud in my empty kitchen. But the people writing about it described a small city on the coast of the Philippines, a place with a low cost of living, warm weather year-round, and, more than anything, a real and thriving community of foreign retirees who had built entire second lives there. I read for hours, then for days. 3 weeks later, I had already bought a ticket. When I told my children, the silence on the phone lasted long enough that I actually asked if the call had dropped. Sarah was the first to speak. "Mom, you don't even know this place." I told her that was exactly why I needed to go. My son was more practical. He asked about safety, about health care, about money, about what would happen if something went wrong on the other side of the world with no family nearby. They were good questions. I didn't have every answer. All I knew was that if I spent one more winter in that house, I was going to keep disappearing a little more each year, and nobody would even notice until there was nothing left of me to notice. So I sold almost everything. The couch Richard and I had picked out together 30 years earlier. The dining table where we'd hosted every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner that I didn't know at the time I would miss so much. It all went in a single Saturday, an estate sale organized by a woman from church who did this for a living, watching strangers walk through my life, picking up pieces of it for $5, $10, whatever they thought it was worth. I kept a small box of photographs, Richard's wedding ring, a few books I couldn't part with, and I folded the rest of my 69 years into 2 suitcases. My plan, at least the plan I told my children, was to go for 6 months, just to see if any of it made sense. I did not know, standing at the gate at Detroit Metro Airport with my boarding pass shaking slightly in my hand, that this flight was about to change the entire rest of my life. What I did know with absolute clarity was that the first week in the Philippines nearly sent me straight back home. The heat hit me before anything else. I landed in the early afternoon, and stepping outside the airport felt like walking into a wall of warm, wet air that had weight to it, something I could almost lean against. My small rented apartment near the boulevard was modest, a simple one-bedroom with a ceiling fan that rattled every time it hit a certain speed, and a window that looked out over a narrow alley instead of the ocean the listing photos had promised. On that first night, I lay in the dark, listening to sounds I had never heard before in my life. Roosters that seemed to have no concept of what time actually was. Dogs barking at each other across rooftops. A television playing loudly from somewhere in the building next door, in a language I couldn't understand a single word of. I lay there and thought with total sober clarity that I had made an enormous mistake. For the first few days, I barely left the apartment. I went to the small grocery store nearby and came straight back, clutching my bag like it was a life vest. I didn't know a single soul in that city. I didn't speak Bisaya or Tagalog, and my own American English, my Michigan accent, my particular way of clipping certain words, sometimes felt like a completely different language to the people I tried to speak with. I called Sarah crying on the 4th day. She asked gently if I wanted to come home. And for one long moment, sitting on the edge of a bed in an apartment 8,000 miles from everything I knew, I almost said, yes. Something stopped me. I still can't fully explain what it was. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fear of going back to that same empty house I had just spent weeks emptying out, of undoing everything I had just done, of admitting to everyone who had quietly doubted me that they had been right all along. So I made a deal with myself instead. One more week. If, after that week, I still wanted to leave, I would leave without any guilt attached to it. I had earned the right to try and to fail. It was during that week that everything started to change. I was sitting alone at a small cafe near the boulevard one late afternoon, watching the water, feeling completely out of place in my own skin, when a woman at the next table leaned over and asked, simply, if I was new to the city. Her name was Linda, a Canadian woman of 72 who had been living in Dumaguete for 6 years. She laughed, not unkindly, when I told her how many days I'd actually been there. Then she said something I have never forgotten. "Honey, everyone who moves here goes through that exact same terrible first week. The only difference is who decides to stay." Linda invited me to a gathering that met every Wednesday evening at a restaurant near the public market. It was a loose, easy mix of American and Australian and European retirees, along with a few Filipino locals who had spent years abroad themselves and had eventually come home. At that table, over the course of 2 hours, I talked more than I had talked in months back in Michigan. A woman named Dorothy, also a widow, said something that landed somewhere deep in my chest. "Nobody here asks what you used to do for a living. They ask what you want to do now." It was the first time in 4 years that anyone had asked me that question. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm slowly began to take shape in my days, the kind of rhythm I hadn't realized I was starving for. I went to the market early in the morning, before the heat became unbearable, and I learned to recognize the vendors the same way they learned to recognize me. There was a woman who sold mangoes near the corner stall who started setting aside the ripest ones just for me, without my ever having to ask. In the evenings, I began taking long walks along the boulevard as the sun went down, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed anywhere in America for a very long time. People here didn't seem to be in any hurry to end a conversation. A young man who sold fresh coconut water from a cart began calling me Nanay Carol, a warm, affectionate way of saying Mother Carol, and as simple as that sounds, it made me cry alone that night, not out of sadness, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with that kind of casual, unearned kindness by people who owed me absolutely nothing. After 6 weeks, I noticed I had stopped counting the days until my return flight. I had started counting the days until I could see what else this city had to show me. But it was an unexpected visit that truly tested what I was quietly beginning to build. In my 2nd month, Sarah announced she was coming to see me. Not a vacation. She made that very clear on the phone. She wanted to see with her own eyes exactly where her mother had ended up. I was more nervous than I had been in years, cleaning the apartment 3 times over, trying to arrange things to look more American, more familiar, less foreign than it actually was, as if I could somehow stage my new life for her approval. When she arrived at the airport, she hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Then she stepped back, looked me up and down, and said something that made me laugh out loud. "Mom, you look different." I asked her if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She just stared at me for a second and shrugged. "Haven't decided yet." The first few days felt a little like an inspection, though I don't think she meant it that way, at least not entirely. She watched everything: the apartment, the neighborhood, the people I spent time with, the way I moved through the city more confidently than I had moved through anything in years. One evening she asked me directly, "Mom, are you running away from something?" I thought about it before I answered. Maybe at the beginning I was, but not anymore. Now I'm running toward something. On the 3rd night, I brought her to the Wednesday dinner with the group, Linda and Dorothy and the others. They welcomed my daughter as though they had known her for years, the way people do when they've spent a long time far from home themselves. By the end of the night, I watched my own daughter laughing, really laughing, for the first time since she'd landed. On the walk back to the apartment, she went quiet for a while and then said softly, "Mom, I think I get it now." I didn't ask her what exactly she understood, I just held her hand and kept walking. When she flew back to the United States, the goodbye felt entirely different from the arrival. She didn't ask when I was coming home. Instead, she asked, "What do you need me to send you from the States?" That was the moment I realized my family had stopped seeing me as someone who needed to be rescued and had started seeing me as someone who had found her place. But there was still a decisive moment ahead of me, one that would determine whether Dumaguete was only a pause or the beginning of an entirely new chapter of my life. The 6 months I had promised everyone, including myself, were coming to an end, and I had to decide whether to book the flight home or renew my visa instead. I made a list one rainy night, the kind of tropical downpour that turns the whole street into a river within minutes, weighing the reasons to go home against the reasons to stay. On the side of going home were my grandchildren, the holidays with the whole family together, a language I understood completely without ever having to think about it, the simple ease of everything being familiar. On the side of staying was a harder list to put into words. The feeling of being called Nane Carol, the Wednesday dinners with Linda and Dorothy, the ocean I had started seeing every single day of my life, and something I hadn't felt in years, the feeling of being needed somewhere by people who had chosen me, not out of obligation, but out of something else entirely. I called my son before I made the final decision. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom, you spent 40 years taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's finally your turn to take care of you." That was all I needed to hear. I renewed my visa. I started looking for a bigger apartment, one with an actual view of the water instead of an alley. It wasn't a decision against my family. It was a decision for myself, the first one I had made purely for myself in longer than I could remember. For the first time in 4 years, since Richard had died, I wasn't merely surviving anymore. I was living. Today marks 2 years since I first arrived in Dumaguete. I live in an apartment with a view of the sea that still takes my breath away some mornings, the light hitting the water in a way I never get tired of watching. I have a small group of women friends who have become closer to me than many friends I had my entire life back in Michigan, closer in some ways than people I had known for decades. Twice a week, I help out at a small community center, teaching English to children in the neighborhood, kids who call me Teacher Carol and run up to hug me before class even starts. That doesn't mean everything became easy. I still miss my husband, every single day, in some way or another. There are still moments I miss my children so much, it physically hurts, a kind of ache in the chest that catches me off guard in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The power outages, the bureaucracy, the extreme heat during certain months of the year, these are real, and they are exhausting in their own particular way. But so is everything else. The laughter, the friendships, the children who call out to me by name in the street, the feeling of being part of something again after years of feeling like I was simply waiting for time to pass. A few months ago, my daughter came to visit again. On the last day, while we waited for the taxi to the airport, she looked at me and said, "Mom, I'm glad you came here. It wasn't thank you. It wasn't congratulations. Just that. I'm glad you came here." I don't think she fully realized how much those words meant to me, because the truth is, I'm glad I came too. Not because it solved every single problem in my life, not because it erased every loss I've carried. Nothing can do that, not a plane ticket, not an ocean view, not a new group of friends, however wonderful they are. But because it reminded me that life doesn't end just because one chapter closes. There can be another chapter, another beginning, another version of yourself waiting somewhere you never expected to find her. Sometimes my children still ask if I'll ever move back to Michigan. I always tell them the same thing. Never say never. Life has surprised me before. It will probably surprise me again. But for now, when I wake up every morning and hear the ocean outside my window, I know exactly where I want to be. And that feeling took me a very, very long time to find. The funny thing is, when I boarded that plane at 69 years old, I thought I was traveling to the Philippines. Looking back now, I wasn't, not really. I was traveling toward a version of myself I thought had disappeared a long time ago, and after all these years, I finally found her. There is a part of this story I don't tell people right away, because it sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it changed everything. It happened about 3 months into my time in Dumaguete, long after the panic of that first week had faded, but before I had fully settled into the life I have now. I had joined a small group that met on Saturday mornings at a community center near the market, a kind of informal conversation circle where retirees and locals practiced English together, swapped stories, and occasionally argued cheerfully about whose home cooking was better. I had gone reluctantly the first time, mostly because Linda insisted, and I sat in the back corner saying almost nothing. But a young woman named Grace, maybe in her early 20s, sat down beside me on my second visit and asked if I had ever taught anyone anything in my life. I told her I had trained new medical assistants for years back home, showing them how to draw blood without terrifying the patient, how to read the fear in someone's eyes before they even said a word. Grace's whole face lit up. She said the center desperately needed people willing to help the younger kids with their English, especially with reading aloud, something the local teachers didn't always have time for given how large their classes were. I hesitated. I told her I wasn't a teacher. She said, kindly but firmly, that neither was she when she started, and that the children didn't need a professional. They needed someone patient enough to sit with them. That Saturday changed the shape of my entire life abroad more than anything else that happened in those early months. I started showing up twice a week, then 3 times, sitting with small groups of children who giggled at my accent and corrected my attempts at their local words with a kind of gentle, delighted mockery that never once felt cruel. There was a boy named Miguel, maybe 8 years old, missing 2 front teeth, who insisted on reading me the same story about a fisherman every single week for a month because he loved watching my face when the ending surprised me, even though I already knew exactly how it ended. I mention this because I think it's easy for people back home to imagine that a decision like mine, moving to the other side of the world alone at 69, is about escape, about running from grief, from loneliness, from a life that no longer fit. And in the very beginning, if I'm honest with myself, there was some truth to that. But somewhere in that community center, surrounded by children who had no idea what my life used to look like and didn't particularly care, I stopped running from anything. I started running toward something instead, toward usefulness, toward the simple, unglamorous joy of being needed by people who had absolutely no obligation to need me. I think about Richard often in that context. We used to talk, in our last years together, about what retirement would actually look like once the noise of raising children and building careers finally quieted down. He imagined golf, I imagined gardening, maybe volunteering at the local library, the way I eventually did for a short while after he passed. Neither of us ever imagined anything close to this. I sometimes wonder what he would think if he could see me now, sitting cross-legged on a tiled floor in the Philippines, listening to an 8-year-old read me the same fisherman's story for the 4th week in a row. Some days I imagine he would laugh at how far I traveled to find something so simple. Other days I imagine he would understand it completely, because he always understood, better than almost anyone, that I needed to feel useful in order to feel like myself. There is another piece of this story that surprised me just as much, maybe more, and that involves my own health. Before I left Michigan, more than one person warned me about healthcare abroad, about what would happen if something went wrong so far from the hospitals and doctors I had worked alongside for nearly 3 decades. I won't pretend those concerns weren't valid, or that I didn't spend long nights researching insurance options and reading forum threads written by other expatriates about their own medical emergencies. But what I found once I arrived surprised me. The private hospital not far from my apartment was clean, modern, and staffed by doctors who took the time to actually sit and talk with me, something I had rarely experienced even back in the United States, where appointments are often measured in minutes rather than genuine conversation. About a year into my time there, I had a health scare of my own, nothing catastrophic in the end, but frightening enough in the moment that I called Linda in a panic at 2 a.m. She came immediately, sat with me in the emergency room, translated when my nerves made it hard to follow what the nurses were saying, and stayed until a doctor confirmed it was something manageable rather than something serious. I remember lying on that hospital bed, exhausted and a little embarrassed, and Linda squeezing my hand and saying, "This is exactly why you don't do this alone, and exactly why none of us here actually are alone. Not really." It was one of those moments that quietly confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. That the community I had stumbled into wasn't just pleasant company for dinners and afternoon walks. It was, in every way that mattered, family. Not a replacement for the family I already had back home, but an addition to it, a second circle of people who showed up when it counted. My son David visited for the first time almost a year after Sarah did. He came skeptical in a way Sarah never quite was, more guarded, asking pointed questions about money, about safety, about what exactly my long-term plan looked like now that 6 months had quietly stretched into something much longer. I understood his caution. He has always been the practical one, the child who wanted spreadsheets and clear answers rather than feelings and vague descriptions of contentment. I didn't try to convince him with words. I simply let him spend a week watching my actual life unfold. He came with me to the market in the early morning and watched the mango vendor set aside the ripest fruit without being asked. He sat in on one of my Saturday sessions at the community center and watched Miguel drag me by the hand to a bookshelf to pick out yet another story. He joined the Wednesday dinner and listened to Dorothy tell the story, for what must have been the 10th time in that group's history, of how she'd arrived a widow at 70 and found, of all things, a genuine second act she never expected. On his last night, sitting on my small balcony with the sound of motorbikes and distant music drifting up from the street below, David admitted something that surprised me. He said that back home, he had pictured this life as somehow smaller than the one I'd had in Michigan, quieter, more isolated, a kind of consolation prize for a woman who had lost her husband and didn't quite know what else to do with herself. Instead, he told me, It looked fuller than almost anything he could remember from our years back home, fuller than his own overscheduled, overworked life currently felt to him. I didn't say anything clever in response. I just told him that grief has a way of making people believe their story is finished, when really it's only turning a page. I want to be honest about the parts of this that are still hard, because I think stories like mine sometimes get flattened into something too neat, too triumphant, as though moving here erased every difficult feeling in one grand gesture. It didn't. There are still nights, more than I'd like to admit, when the loneliness returns without warning, usually triggered by something small and unexpected. A song that used to play in our kitchen on Sunday mornings, the particular way the light falls through a window at a certain hour, reminding me of our old house rather than this one. A holiday that arrives quietly on the calendar here, unmarked and unnoticed by anyone around me, while I know exactly what my family back home would be doing at that very moment without me. I have learned, slowly and imperfectly, to let those nights exist without letting them define the whole of my life here. I call Sarah, even when it's the middle of the night for her, and she is patient with me the way I once tried to be patient with her when she was small and couldn't sleep. I sit on my balcony and let myself cry if that's what the night calls for, and then, more often than not, I fall asleep to the sound of the ocean and wake up the next morning ready to walk to the market again, ready to see Miguel wave at me from across the community center, ready to laugh with Linda and Dorothy over plates of food I never once imagined eating at 69 years old. If there is one thing I would want another woman my age to understand, someone sitting alone in her own kitchen in some quiet American town, staring at a plate she cooked for two people out of habit, it would be this. The fear you feel is not a sign that you're making the wrong decision. It is simply the sound of an old life letting go, slowly and reluctantly, to make room for something new. I was terrified standing at that airport gate in Detroit. I was terrified lying awake that first night listening to roosters and dogs and a television in a language I didn't understand. I was terrified sitting alone at that cafe before Linda ever said a single word to me. The fear never fully disappeared. What changed was my relationship to it. I stopped waiting for it to go away before I allowed myself to live, and instead I learned to live alongside it. One Wednesday dinner, one Saturday morning at the community center, one mango carefully set aside for me at a time. People sometimes ask if I regret waiting so long to make a change like this, if I wish I had done it at 60 instead of 69, or even earlier, back when Richard was still alive, and we might have done it together. I used to feel a small ache of regret when people ask that question. Now I mostly don't. I think some decisions can only be made by the exact version of yourself that eventually makes them, shaped by exactly the losses and the waiting and the quiet desperation that led there. I don't know if the 60-year-old version of me, still married, still surrounded by the comforting noise of a full house, would have recognized what I needed the way the 69-year-old widow standing in her empty kitchen finally did. What I know now, 2 years and a lifetime away from that kitchen table in Michigan, is that it is never too late to become someone new, or perhaps more accurately, to become someone you already were a very long time ago, before life quietly buried her under decades of other people's needs. I thought, at 69, that my story was mostly finished, that whatever chapters remained would simply be an epilogue to a life that had already been fully written. I was wrong. Sometimes the most important chapter is the one that begins after everyone assumes your story is already over. Some evenings, when the heat has finally broken and the boulevard fills with families out for their evening walk, I sit near the water with a cup of coffee and watch the sun go down over the sea. And I think about that woman standing at the gate in Detroit, her hands shaking around a boarding pass, utterly convinced she was making the biggest mistake of her life. I wish I could reach back across those 2 years and tell her what I know now. I wish I could tell her that the mistake was never the flight. The mistake would have been staying in that kitchen, waiting quietly for the rest of her life to simply happen to her, instead of finally, at 69 years old, deciding to go out and meet it herself. There is one more memory I keep returning to, maybe because it captures everything better than any of the bigger moments I've already described. It was an ordinary Tuesday, nothing special marked on the calendar, nothing to distinguish it from 100 other Tuesdays I've had here. I woke up before sunrise out of habit, made my coffee, and walked down to the market while the air was still cool enough to be comfortable. The mango vendor waved before I even reached her stall. A man selling fresh bread called out a greeting in Bisaya that I still didn't fully understand, but I had learned by then to smile and wave back, and that was always enough. On my way home, I passed the community center and heard voices already gathering inside for the morning session, even though it wasn't officially my day to be there. I stepped in anyway, just to say hello, and found Miguel sitting at a table with a new book he hadn't shown me yet, waiting, he told me very seriously, because he wanted me to be the first person he read it to. I sat down. I had nowhere else to be. That, more than any single dramatic turning point, is what this new life has actually given me. Not one grand transformation, but an accumulation of small, ordinary mornings where I have somewhere to be and someone waiting for me when I arrive. Back in Michigan, in those 4 long years after Richard died, my days had no shape at all. One morning bled into the next with nothing to distinguish them. No reason to get out of bed other than the fact that eventually I had to. Here, even on the quietest days, there is a shape to my life again. A market to walk to. A child waiting with a book. A Wednesday dinner to look forward to. A balcony where I can sit with my coffee and watch the water change color as the sun comes up. It sounds like such a small thing to build a life around, and yet it turned out to be exactly the thing I had been missing the whole time. The thing no amount of family phone calls or well-meaning visits back home could quite replace. I don't know how many more chapters are left for me. I am 71 now. 2 years into this life I once thought would only last 6 months, and I have stopped trying to guess how the rest of the story goes. What I do know, with a certainty I never expected to feel again at my age, is that I would make the same decision every single time, even knowing everything difficult that came with it. The fear at the airport, the terrible first week, the nights I still miss Richard so much it takes my breath away. All of it, every part of it, led me here, to a small apartment with a view of the sea, to a community that chose me, to a little boy who saves his favorite stories just to watch my face when I hear the ending. If my younger self, the woman who spent 41 years building a life she thought would never change, could see me now, sitting on this balcony as the evening call to prayer drifts faintly from somewhere across the water, mixing with the sound of children playing in the street below, I think she would be surprised, not disappointed, surprised, because nothing about this life resembles anything either of us ever planned for, and yet somehow, against every quiet fear I carried onto that plane, It turned out to be exactly the life I needed. Sometimes people who find my story online ask me the same question, over and over, in different words. They ask how they can know for certain whether they are brave enough to do something like this themselves, whether they have whatever it is I apparently have that let me walk away from everything familiar at an age when most people are simply trying to hold on to what they already built. I never quite know how to answer that honestly, because I don't think I felt brave at any point in this story. Not at the airport, not during that first terrible week, not even now, 2 years in, on the nights when the loneliness still finds its way back through some unexpected crack in an otherwise ordinary evening. What I tell them instead is something closer to the truth. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I had nothing left to lose by trying, which is a very different feeling entirely. Bravery, I think, is what other people call it when they look at a decision from the outside, once it has already worked out well enough to be worth admiring. From the inside, in the middle of it, it rarely feels like courage at all. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like being so tired of an empty kitchen, so tired of a life that had quietly stopped asking anything of you, that the unknown finally becomes less frightening than staying exactly where you are. I think about the version of myself who sat at that kitchen table asking an empty room what she was doing with the time she had left, and I understand now that she wasn't asking a question she expected anyone to answer for her. She was asking permission from herself to finally do something about it. It took her 3 weeks of reading forums late into the night to give herself that permission. It took her selling a house full of 40 years of memories in a single Saturday afternoon. It took her standing at a gate in Detroit with her hands shaking and somehow walking through it anyway. I don't know what her equivalent of Dumaguete looks like for anyone else reading or watching this. It might be another country entirely. It might be something far smaller and closer to home, a new hobby, a new friendship, a decision to finally say no to something that has quietly drained her for years. I only know that whatever it is probably waiting on the other side of a fear that feels, right now, larger than it actually is. It certainly felt that way to me, standing in my kitchen in Michigan, staring at a laptop screen at 11 o'clock at night, typing the words Dumaguete Philippines Retirement Community into a search bar, half expecting nothing useful to come back at all. Something useful came back, and 3 weeks later, so did a plane ticket. And 2 years after that, here I am, sitting on a balcony overlooking the sea, listening to a little boy 2 streets away, probably falling asleep with the very book he insisted on reading to me just that morning, in a life I once would have told you, with complete confidence, could never possibly belong to someone like me.